Imagine standing in a crowded square. The sun is blazing overhead. The smell of dust and incense fills the air. A royal drum beats in the distance, and before you, towering over the people, is an armored elephant, not a symbol of peace, not a creature of war, but an executioner. In ancient India, justice wasn't always blind. Sometimes it had tusks. And when the king wanted to make an example, he didn't whisper a sentence. He unleashed it. Elephants were trained from youth to obey complex commands, not just to march or fight, but to kill with precision. Persian historians in the medieval period, and even Greek and Roman visitors centuries earlier, recorded their horror and awe at what they saw. A trained elephant could step on a criminal's head instantly, killing him without prolonged suffering. For centuries, this punishment was viewed not as cruelty, but as order. It was a way for kings to demonstrate their divine right to rule, to remind the people that justice was swift and unchallengeable. A ruler who could command an elephant to kill, who could control chaos itself, was seen as nearly divine. These were events choreographed with ritual, royal presence, and sometimes even music. The condemned might be paraded first, humiliated, then brought to the execution ground where the elephant draped in silks and gold stood, waiting like a living god of punishment. In Part 2, we will explore the deeper cultural psychology behind this practice, how elephants became both protectors and punishers. We'll uncover the symbolic power that made rulers feel invincible and the terrifying truths that made enemies fall silent. Because in ancient India, justice had weight. Elephants were used in temples, in royal parades, and in warfare. In rare cases, historical records describe how a king would approach the execution ground and, after witnessing the condemned's repentance, command the elephant to halt. The massive creature would stop instantly, hovering its foot just above the man's chest. For them, execution by elephant was evidence of a savage, barbaric land. It was seen as incompatible with the image the colonizers wanted to present, a modern, orderly, civilized empire. The elephants were stripped of their roles as instruments of justice. They were confined to temples, circuses, and parades. The ritual was silenced. The roar of the crowd faded. This was what happened when someone challenged the divine order. We see them as symbols of wisdom, guardians of memory, victims of captivity. But behind their gentle eyes, behind the poetry and the reverence, lies a legacy few dare to speak about. A past where justice walked on four legs, where kings ruled with a single word, and where silence fell not from peace, but from fear. This was what happened when you defied the sacred law. The king did not need an army, and the only thing more powerful than its strength was the hand that held its leash. He needed one beast, a beast that could kill with precision, a beast that could stop with mercy, a beast that stood as a living message: power does not whisper. It crushes, and the execution ground became just another story from a forgotten past. But the memory didn't die. They failed to understand its roots in ritual, discipline, and symbolism. It appears in movies, novels, and video games, sometimes as horror, sometimes as legend, but always as something shocking, something unforgettable. The elephant was never just a killer. It was a mirror. It reflected the heart of the kingdom. If the king was wise, the elephant was merciful. If the king was cruel, the elephant became terrifying. It was never the animal's fault. It was always the hand that commanded it. That hand spoke not only to the elephant, but to the people, because the truth is, no one who witnessed it ever truly forgot. The slow march, the raised trunk, the silence before the order, and then the end sudden or prolonged, merciful or monstrous. In their writings, they described India as exotic and cruel, never grasping that their own countries had equally brutal punishments: gallows, drawing and quartering, burning at the stake. The difference was in the spectacle. Europe hid its executions behind walls. India put them on display, not to entertain, but to educate. The people would gasp. The criminal would collapse in tears. And the king, moved by this dramatic plea for mercy, would pardon him. In that moment, the elephant became not just a weapon, but a stage for redemption. The crowd would cheer, and the ruler would rise in glory, both feared and adored. Justice had been served, but so had compassion. This dual symbolism of punishment and mercy made execution by elephant not just a tool of fear, but a performance of divine power. They carried kings, crushed enemy lines, and knelt before sacred shrines. Under Mughal rule, the tradition continued, sometimes even refined. Emperor Akbar, known for his balance of justice and tolerance, reportedly used elephants both for execution and public demonstration. He was known to walk among his elephants, speak to them softly, and treat them as friends. Yet when law demanded, he would command one to kill, not out of cruelty, but to remind his court that justice must be impartial, no matter how personal or painful. Their intelligence was admired, their memories legendary. And perhaps it was this intelligence that made their use in execution so chilling. These were not wild beasts lashing out. They were calm, obedient, controlled, capable of both restraint and destruction. That duality is what made them terrifying. A ruler who could tame such power and unleash it on command was not merely a king, he was a force of nature in the eyes of his people. And sometimes it marched on four legs. The moment of death was watched not just by the people, but by the ruler himself. In some stories, kings would change the sentence mid-execution, asking the elephant to spare a man to display mercy or to crush him further to show anger. The message was clear: defy the throne, and even nature will crush you. European colonizers who arrived in India in the 17th and 18th centuries were often shocked to learn that execution by elephant was still used in some princely states. It was not abolished by moral awakening, it disappeared with modernization. But even in fading, its impact lingered. And elephants, giants among beasts, were the perfect enforcers of that will. Their sheer size, their presence, their sacred status made them both executioner and symbol. In such cases, the death was more about the symbolism, that man's fate rested under the divine will of the ruler. To be sentenced to death by elephant was to be declared utterly powerless. In ancient India, kings were more than rulers. They were seen as protectors of divine order, upholders of Dharma, the cosmic law. Justice was not only a legal matter, it was a spiritual duty. And elephants, majestic and deeply woven into religious and cultural mythology, were more than animals. They were symbols. Sacred, intelligent, divine. When they were used to execute a criminal, it was not seen as mere punishment, it was perceived as a holy judgment, carried out by a beast that could channel the will of the gods themselves. The king didn't need a sword. He had nature itself bowing to his authority. One Persian chronicler wrote of elephants that were taught to fling their victims into the air before trampling them. Another wrote of a condemned man placed in chains, as the elephant, on royal command, ripped him apart slowly, always stopping at the brink of death until finally finishing him when the king gave a final signal. In some cases, they were taught to crush the skull in a single blow. In others, to dismember slowly one limb at a time, prolonging the agony as a lesson to the watching crowd. And the crowd always watched. These executions weren't hidden. In some southern Indian kingdoms, like the Chola dynasty, elephants were said to be part of military justice. A soldier found guilty of cowardice could be executed by elephant in front of his regiment. In northern India, particularly under Mughal rulers like Akbar and Shah Jahan, the punishment evolved. Elephants were not only used for executions, but sometimes for torture and intimidation. In certain cases, criminals were bound beneath the animal, or made to run until trampled, depending on the offense, the spectacle, and the ruler's mood. They were public performances of power, staged in royal courtyards, temple steps, and bustling marketplaces. Execution by elephant. It sounds too brutal to be true, yet for over 1,000 years, it was very real. It wasn't a myth. It wasn't a legend. It was a system of punishment practiced across the Indian subcontinent and even admired and feared by visiting empires. The sheer power of it, the spectacle, the message, it was not only about death, it was about control, fear, absolute submission. Because in ancient India, when a man defied the crown or broke sacred law, his fate was placed beneath the crushing weight of a living god. This method of execution dates back as early as 500 BCE, during the time of powerful kingdoms like the Maurya Empire. Elephants were not just beasts of burden or warriors in battle. They were sacred, revered, and deeply tied to Hindu mythology associated with the god Ganesha, the remover of obstacles. Yet, in the hands of a king, they became instruments of royal judgment. In the grand courts of emperors like Ashoka the Great, justice could be swift. And if a man betrayed the throne, insulted the gods, or committed a heinous act, he might find himself dragged not to a sword, not to a noose, but to the feet of a trained elephant. But these weren't random stampedes. These were deliberate, orchestrated executions. Historical accounts from foreign travelers offer chilling glimpses. And yet, not all executions were savage. In some traditions, the elephant was used to carry out swift, merciful justice. The deeper horror lies not just in the act, but in its normalization. There were variations across regions. And yet, these acts were not purely for vengeance. They were deeply woven into the politics of fear. Perhaps the most haunting part of this practice is how precise and intentional it was. These were not chaotic scenes of bloodlust. Even centuries later, long after the practice faded, echoes remained. The scars of this ancient justice still ripple through time. To understand the full terror and meaning behind execution by elephant, one must look deeper, not just into the cruelty of the act, but into what it represented. The Hindu god Ganesha, the elephant-headed deity, was worshipped as the remover of obstacles and lord of wisdom. But even in this brutality, there were moments that revealed a strange sense of mercy. But as India moved into the medieval period, and later into the age of empires and colonization, the spectacle began to change. As time passed, other powers began to take notice. European traders and missionaries arriving in the 17th and 18th centuries were often horrified by the accounts they heard and witnessed. Eventually, under British rule, execution by elephant was banned. To this day, the idea of execution by elephant lives on in folklore, literature, and even modern pop culture. What remains is not just a method of death, but a profound insight into how justice, power, fear, and faith were intertwined. And perhaps that's why the practice held for so long. It wasn't just about punishing a man. It was about reminding the masses. Now, centuries later, we no longer see elephants as instruments of death. So next time you look into the eyes of an elephant, remember beneath that calm, majestic presence, there was once a time when the fate of a man rested beneath its feet.